Nowadays, Breath of Fire is just a relic of an older time, and it fits most of the cliches incredibly well. This series started on the Super Nintendo, and it died once it gave in to the temptation of being fully 3D. No new games have been released since the early PS2 Breath of Fire 5, well except for the universally disliked Breath of Fire 6, which was a Japan-exclusive mobile game filled with microtransactions and is already unavailable thanks to the joy of digital marketplaces removing games. But looking at traditional games, the franchise has been dead since 2003 and arguably even longer, since the fifth title is still quite a series departure, but in hindsight it wasn't a full betrayal like 6 was. During the early days of the Dark Times, before people even knew these were Dark Times, the series was kept alive with remakes. Breath of Fire 3 on PSP is my favourite way of experiencing my first entry with the series. But what about the first of the remakes, Breath of Fire 1 for Game Boy Advance? Much like 3's port, which I've already discussed, this is a very faithful remake with very few changes, so this could also serve as a review of a SNES version, which is convenient for me in the YouTube algorithm, as the SNES version is readily available on the Nintendo Switch's online subscription service. There are a few differences, two key ones. I'll divulge the details later, but a key difference you will note is the translation. The Super Nintendo Breath of Fire games had terrible localization, and this was fixed with the Game Boy Advance remakes. If you are some kind of stickler for getting an authentic experience and don't want fan translations, which I imagine for the retro JRPG community is just like one single guy out there, the GBA version is the way to go. This is doubly so for the sequel. My lawyers have advised me not to encourage emulation, so if you want the authentic experience on the cheap, just play the Super Famicom online versions on the Switch and learn Japanese, okay? But hey, if you like bad translations, just raw dog it with the original localizations, it has its charms. Regardless of which version you play, the game opens up to the protagonist's village under fire from an outside threat. But Sarah, the protagonist's older sister, distracts the invaders and subsequently fights them. She has real girl boss energy and she defeats almost all the threats here instantly. Then she's up against the Commander Jade in a one-on-one fight, which is much tougher. During this, we get more exposition. Jade is from the Dark Dragon group, and Sarah and the rest of our town are light dragons. Jade's plan is to awaken the goddess Tia, who we'll learn more about later. We get more literal exposition after this, as text on screen lays out more of the lore of this universe, some of which the characters aren't even fully aware of, plus they really wouldn't be able to talk about this while fighting to the death. The dragons used to fight each other just to see the goddess who could grant whichever wish they wanted, and Tia was happy to watch this all unfold. But eventually, a hero came along and sealed her away and hid the keys all over the world that would unlock the entrance to her prison. After this lore exposition, we get to leave our town and go on a long adventure, and the game's story is put on halt for a long time. This game has a lot of memorable encounters and interactions, but they're not directly furthering the story. As a first-time JRPG for the company, one that was taking obvious inspiration from bigger series out there, Breath of Fire 1 at times feels more like a classic Dragon Quest game, instead of something more substantial in terms of its story. I'm not saying Breath of Fire is an outright clone or anything, it does a lot of unique things, but for the story, especially early on, this is just a series of memorable towns with their own struggles, and thankfully solving these leads us to the next isolated town plight. All the while, some story stuff is happening in the background, we're just not privy to it until much later. But when it does come, it comes crashing down and it's fantastic. This was a trope of the genre after all, especially at this time, but there were still other games of this time being a lot more dramatic and a lot less safe. Despite that, the world of the series is one I adore and I feel like this is a great introduction to it. The world is full of so many different races occupying it, to the point that out of our total 8 party members, we only have one that's actually a human. And it's not even our protagonist, since he is, in what will be a series tradition, is essentially a dragon that can live in human form. But he is still nonetheless not a human. Our one token human is still able to stop being one as well, as he learns the ability to fuse with other party members to become one of multiple different hybrid species, at the expense of his other characters not being usable during this time. I adore this team, just on the designs and the variety alone, but what little personalities we see are very nice. I just wish we got to see a bit more of him. Something like Dragon Quest's Party Chat or Breath of Fire 3's Campfire would have turned this good party into a great one. But with what we have here, this party is still a personal favourite of mine, just for the designs. I'm sorry, I'm a bit shallow, but they do look that good. I'd love to see them on a tapestry or something. But my love for them honestly doesn't just amount to their appearance. These characters have great utility with their character-specific actions. If we set a character as the lead, we can perform various tasks with each one. The thief can pick locks, the mole can dig, the wolf lets us walk through trees for some reason, and that last one in particular is an unbelievable time saver. Some of these abilities are locked away until moments of character development, like our fish becoming an even bigger fish, or our princess can unlock her anamorph power of turning into a bird, something you frankly shouldn't get too used to in this series. This cast of 8 distinct characters get no real complaints from me, except for maybe that it's 6 men and 2 women, and all the human looking characters are pretty white here. But since the original Super Famicom version of the game had our thief Khan, in what can most generously be described as a bit of an insensitive look, maybe it's for the best. Although, if it was up to me, I would have just given this originally black character a less demeaning look instead of just winding him up. But hey, I'm not some 1990s localizers. Khan's complicated look can be glossed over, since he's the one who is the base of the fusions. We don't really see him just be a regular guy most of the time, he's some kind of weird fish wolf monster. I wanted to talk about my love of the cast first, because the rest of the game isn't as great. It's more typical of the genre. Town conflicts aren't too substantial, but their designs are varied and no two really feel the same. Whether that be the zombie-filled Romero, or the bleak town full of thieves, or to the underwater city that keeps this game feeling really creative all throughout. Each city also has a save point that can be fast traveled to with a spell, which once again does sound pretty standard, but there's nothing wrong with the classic formula here, as it is a convenience, especially for those playing the Super Nintendo version of this game. Frankly, this game is slow on consoles. There is no way to run. That wasn't introduced until the sequel, and while it would become a tradition for the series, and was included in the GBA remake, the original version of the game does feel sorely lacking, and it does feel unbearable if you place the two side by side. For that reason alone, people say the GBA version is the definitive version, if we're not including modded ROMs or emulator speed hacks or anything else like that. And while I'm happy to oblige that, I will just say the soundtrack is hindered in the GBA. The SNES has much better sound hardware than the Game Boy Advance. That should be pretty obvious. These great tunes are butchered in this port, but I do have a soft spot for the GBA crunch. I grew up with this, I'm used to music sounding terrible. But if you do put them side by side, what's a bit crunchy becomes horribly butchered. I will say, while playing the Game Boy Advance version of this game, I had no issues with the music, even if I did acknowledge it was a bit crunchier than I may have preferred. But when you listen to both side by side, it is night and day. The Game Boy Advance music is frankly pretty terrible, and that's the one I'm using in the background of this, so enjoy. On the other side of this series of ups and downs of this port, what most people, but probably not some purists with more time on this planet than the rest of us, will enjoy is that this handheld version, like many others, provided the player more experience points, so less time needs to be wasted. Thank you. I love this edition. I love this edition whenever it's added to RPG remakes, and usually I have no issues with it. If I can get through Persona 2 without hating myself, great, I love it. But this game does feel a bit too easy now because of this. Breath of Fire 1 was never the most difficult entry in the series, so this might be a moot point for some, but if you're looking for challenges, you just won't find them here. And that's even when I am skipping a lot of fights. If you're new to the game, or haven't played it in a long time and just don't want to use a walkthrough, first of all, good luck, and second of all, you'll find yourself at much higher levels than you'll need to be for any given section, as you'll keep wandering around. There isn't much depth to the combat here, and you can brute force with regular attacks if you want. Our main healing character is loaded with healing spells, has a giant pool of AP, you get her very early, and this game lets you refill AP with a very cheap magic healing item, meaning you don't even have to worry about being resourceful. But also depending on your outlook, this also means you can spice up combat with as many spells as you want, and you don't have to worry about conserving it. You can make this game way more fun if you want. You can keep using the signature dragon ability, but life is so fleeting it's easier just to keep pressing the button to move through combat quickly. Breath of Fire 3 was my introduction to the dragon concept, and it was a much more interesting system than it was here. The dragon system had a lot of risks to it, but Breath of Fire 1 being the first game in the series obviously didn't have as much hindsight in this regard. Becoming a dragon is pretty boring here. You get the dragon forms after fighting certain one-on-one battles, which might seem cool thematically or in universe, but we are playing as a character who cannot do spells, and he's the only playable character, and he's attacking an enemy that has a large health bar. So just keep attacking, use one of your healing items, keep attacking, rinse and repeat. Even Dragon Quest I has more depth than this. Thankfully this is a small part of the game, but it is a recurring part of the game. But after we beat those simple fights, we can become dragons in battle, at the cost of some AP on the turn we summon it. We can revert back to a humanoid form whenever we want, but there's no real lasting costs or downsides to this. It's honestly a pretty meh inclusion. At the end of the game, we do unlock our first interesting dragon form, which is a fusion of our entire party, which does mean there is a bit of a risk associated with it, but once we get over that, we're back to just controlling one single character that can't really do much except attack with strong attacks, and then this just becomes the annoying fights from earlier. And while for the most part, battles are just a dull experience, they can be much worse. There are spells in Breath of Fire 1 that flash multiple colours and they hurt my eyes, one in particular. And I'm fortunate enough not to experience seizures or anything more severe than annoyance and eye strain. If you are susceptible to seizures from flashing lights, look away whenever the spell Nova is used. I will say it's easier to do that with a portable if you're playing this on one, but this is still a disgusting inclusion and I hate that my solution to a serious medical condition is just to look away from the screen, but it's all I can do. But to get back on the topic of battles, it's easy to say I didn't like them in this game. But there were some nice additions. Our party of 8 plus multiple fusions were diverse, and you could do a lot of different combos with them. We even had some situational attacks like fish-based ones that could only be used underwater. And while this may sound weird, the battle locations were great. JRPGs do one of two things when battles occur. They either have the battle occur literally where you are, which is more common in newer titles and especially action RPGs, but it isn't exclusive to them. Breath of Fire 3 comes to mind as an older turn-based game with these, but you'll see it in some games like Dragon Quest XI, even if it does cheat a little by moving you to a slightly different location if the game calls for it. And the brand new Pokemon Legends Arceus does this as well, and it wonderfully transitions from overworld to battle. On the other side of this, you have battles occur in some kind of representation of your location, which is what most games default to, whether they be 8-bit or brand new. And I get it, it's much easier to design battle arenas like this, and it's not really an immersion breaker, we're all kind of numb to this. Almost every turn-based JRPG I can think of does this. Sometimes these battle locations are generic, but we also get more detailed ones, and Breath of Fire 1 puts these amateurs to shame. We have unique battle locations for almost every situation we could be in. Even these one-tile wide entrances to the ocean have beaches to go with them. But this extends to things like bridges of this dungeon having a different background to the rest of the dungeon. Or this other dungeon where the walls turn invisible has two sets of backgrounds depending on if the walls were visible or not at the time of the battle. The dungeons have a lot of variety in the tiles that we fight on. Much later in the game, we even have a dungeon that has movement tiles as the gimmick in a very small section of it. And that section gets its own battle location. They could have easily done a generic background for a dungeon, or even a few standard dungeon templates copy and pasted throughout the game, but instead they went for this, and I love it. Factor this in with the game's day and night cycle, which does include dusk and dawn, and outside locations get love too. It might sound like a backhanded compliment to say the backgrounds the fights occur in is the best part of the fights, but I don't care, they're great. Combat isn't bad here, it's just basic, which wasn't uncommon at the time, especially with a brand new series. But this is done exceptionally, and it puts the battles above a lot of other first-time series on this alone. But when the game isn't being simple battles, it's primarily exploration and dungeons. I'll start with the positives. The dungeons are fun, and while they are carried by the unique designs, that's not all they accomplish. Some have fun puzzles that never overstay their welcome, and they can even put character abilities to great use. Some dungeons didn't have the most fun layouts, but they all felt distinct, with no two really feeling the same. So I guess that's something else. I was never bored, I just had a different range of positive and negative emotions. Random encounters did cause me to lose my direction on occasion, but the game is happy for you to spam repelling items which are cheap and can be stacked. This will remove any tedium in the worst locations, and the pace will increase dramatically. And on the topic of pace, the developers spared us a few injustices. On occasion, when a character needs to be somewhere they've already been earlier, we'll just be teleported there, meaning we don't have to journey there again. And for GBA players, we get a temporary save ability from the main menu, so you can just break it up into smaller moments if that's more your speed. World exploration has similar pros and cons to the dungeons. This is a really varied world, and it's a joy to see what it has to offer. It's at its best when the world changes, like removing snow from one town, or watching another town get wiped off the face of the world. Frustration occurs as the way forward isn't always clear, and since this is one of those games where progress is gated if we don't talk to specific NPCs who know the way forward, there may be some negative emotions that the game will bring up. And even when that isn't an issue, the world opens up in large enough chunks at any one time, and you could get the order of locations wrong. You may visit Town B instead of Town A first, or you could go to the dungeon before getting an item you need from NPC C. This isn't a game that requires a walkthrough by any means, but it's a game that is improved with quick looks at one whenever you're stuck, so you don't walk around in circles for hours. It was the 90s, and I won't judge a game extra harshly for letting players get stuck. These were games that weren't meant to be played in a single week. This was a kid's life for like 6 months, and those hotlines and magazine guides won't pay for themselves. It's understandable, but it is unfortunate today. But hey, Breath of Fire mega fans out there that play this game like every year, they won't need guides, and they'll breeze through the game in a single sitting. So like with many other games, this is a problem at first, but it won't be for future replays. I can think of a few ways they could have easily alleviated this, and players wouldn't have needed to rely on guides. And as this is a remake that I'm playing, they could have put those into action. But you need to remember, this isn't a Metroid Zero mission. This is a relatively low effort way of preserving the original classic and allowing a new generation to experience it. And that is fine. I honestly don't expect more with the way Breath of Fire was ever treated, even during its peak. This is a great series that struggled for popularity and relevance. But you might be thinking, I spent the last chunk of this video talking about how I got lost constantly and how the game's combat is boring. Why do I consider this great? Well, for starters, Breath of Fire 1 was the template sequels built off. Well, until they didn't, but that's a topic for much later. And this template has a wonderful foundation. It's a great world with memorable species, lore, it has freaking dragons, and best of all, it is full of memorable moments. Between every low point or section where I stopped to see what was written on GameFAQs decades ago, the game blasted creativity, and these are the moments I look back on. And this game does have memorable moments that will stick in your brain and you'll compartmentalize for later. For example, what is this dirt for? What do these doors do? Well, come back later, you'll remember where they are, you don't need a guide for them. They stick right out and they will annoy you so much that you will not forget them. They are great design. And unlike, say, Dragon Quest style locked doors, there aren't an overwhelming amount of those that you're due to forget a couple. Some moments of the game that stood out for me included a forced stealth section of all things, which I liked just because you actually had to wait until the town became nighttime so the guard at the front of the town was asleep. But we also had to play as the fish character and get him to go underwater to get gills for our non-fish party members so they could come underwater. And then the next few hours became this underwater adventure, complete with the ability to summon fish in combat. Later on we got shrunken down and had to fight cockroaches and use holes in the wall like a mouse. After that, we had to go inside a character's brain and talk to representations of their feelings. And frankly, the whole ending, when I look back on this game's story, I usually think back to the last few hours of it, when the story is front and center and the stakes have been risen, and it will all be paid off wonderfully. Breath of Fire 1 must have been proud of its story since we get the end of the game with a victory lap, like classic Dragon Quest. And the next two games continue this story, with Breath of Fire 3 in particular treating this all as an important legend. And this is well deserved. I do like the story, especially when I put it in relation to the rest of the series and see this as an integral part of events. But during the game, the story is usually not the focus, and for the early parts you'd even be forgiven for forgetting there was a story. Is Breath of Fire 1 a great game? Not really, but neither was the first Dragon Quest, or Final Fantasy, or Megami Tensei, or Pokemon, or Lufia, which I know isn't on the same cultural standing as those, but it should be. But Breath of Fire 1 is better than all those first entries, and I thoroughly enjoyed most of my time with it. But it was an enjoyment, and rarely a, wow, this is the best, this is an underrated classic the world needs to play more. I had a smile on my face, but not a huge one, you know? Breath of Fire 1, for all its shortcomings, is still a game I appreciate and I do love it, even if it's just for the legacy it created over the next 10 or so years before crumbling away. I think of this game the same way I look back on, well, classic Dragon Quest. It's fun. It's not particularly deep or amazing, but it's fun. This is one of Capcom's best franchises, and it all had to start somewhere. And now I've tackled 2 of the games in this series. I'm over a dragon quarter of the way through talking about them all. Ugh, why did I put that in the script?